Before Christmas was ever a celebration, it was a confrontation. Before it became a season of warmth, generosity, and light, it was a reminder of how fragile life truly was. In the ancient regions of Central Europe, deep within the Alps, the forests of Bavaria, and the isolated valleys of what is now Austria and Slovenia, winter did not simply arrive, it claimed territory. The first snow was not beautiful, it was a warning. Paths disappeared overnight, rivers turned to ice traps, hunting became dangerous, crops failed. Fires burned day and night, yet never felt warm enough. And silence, thick, oppressive silence, settled over villages like a presence of its own. People did not fear winter because it was cold, they feared it because it judged. Every mistake made during the year returned in winter with consequences. Poor planning meant hunger, disobedience meant danger, waste meant death. And children, the most vulnerable members of the community, were always at the center of that risk. In this world, childhood was not protected by comfort, it was shaped by reality. Children were taught early that survival depended on rules. You did not wander into the forest alone. You did not ignore elders. You did not waste food. You did not test boundaries. And when words were not enough, fear became the teacher. This fear did not come from cruelty, it came from necessity. And slowly, over generations, that fear took a form. They did not create him in a single story. They did not write him into a book. They felt him before they named him. Krampus. He was never introduced as a monster. He was introduced as a presence. Something that moved when winter deepened, something that watched when nights grew longer, something that listened when children laughed too loudly or ignored warnings too easily. Krampus was not associated with fire or hell. He was associated with snow, forests, mountains, and darkness. His appearance mirrored the land itself. Goat horns like the animals that climbed frozen cliffs, thick fur like creatures that survived blizzards, hooves instead of feet, heavy and deliberate, leaving marks in snow that could not be mistaken for human tracks. His face was not exaggerated. It was unsettling because it felt plausible, as if nature itself had leaned forward and revealed a face behind the storm. Krampus was not chaos. He was consequence given form. Ancient Alpine belief systems did not separate the natural and the moral world. Storms punished arrogance, avalanches punished carelessness, hunger punished waste. These were not seen as random events, but as responses. Krampus was the messenger of those responses. When elders spoke of him, they did not shout his name, they did not dramatize. They spoke calmly, seriously, as if describing something inevitable. Krampus comes in winter. Krampus knows who listens. Krampus remembers. He did not need to act often. The possibility of his arrival was enough. His chains, according to stories, could be heard before he was seen, not because he was careless, but because he announced himself. He did not sneak. He warned. That warning was the lesson. Children learned quickly that actions mattered even when no one was watching. Krampus was said to see what parents could not. He noticed the quiet disobedience, the hidden defiance, the small acts that could grow into dangerous habits. In this sense, Krampus was not cruel. He was preventative. Modern interpretations often misunderstand this. They imagine Krampus as sadistic, violent, or evil. But in his earliest form, Krampus rarely harmed. His presence alone corrected behavior. Fear replaced punishment. And fear saved lives. As winter progressed, stories of Krampus grew stronger, not louder, but heavier. He walked the forest paths, he lingered near village edges. He stood just beyond the firelight, where darkness swallowed detail. He was never fully seen. That was intentional. Krampus existed in uncertainty. You never knew if he was truly there or if the fear itself was doing the work. And that ambiguity made him powerful. Krampus was not worshipped. There were no temples, no prayers. He did not ask for devotion. He demanded awareness. He was not a god, he was a boundary. In pagan cosmology, balance governed all things. Growth required decay, summer required winter, life required death. These cycles were not moralized, they were accepted. Krampus represented the corrective side of that balance. He was not the bringer of winter, he was the reminder of what winter punished. This is why Krampus appeared only certain times of year. He was seasonal, predictable, bound to the rhythm of nature. He was not random terror, he was structured fear. As centuries passed, stories traveled, villages traded versions, details changed, but the core remained untouched. Krampus watched children, Krampus enforced order, Krampus arrived when rules were ignored. Then something changed. A new belief system began moving through Europe, one that spoke of forgiveness, salvation, and eternal life, a system that brought light into dark places. And with it came a man, a real man, a man who would forever alter Krampus's role in human memory. His name was Nicholas. When Saint Nicholas entered the world of myth, he did not do so gently. History remembers him as a kind bishop, a protector of children, a giver of secret gifts. But mythology remembers him differently. Mythology remembers him as a force of disruption, because wherever Nicholas arrived, the old balance was challenged. Saint Nicholas was not born into legend, he became one. In the early centuries of Christianity, stories of his generosity spread across the Roman world. He was said to leave gold for the poor under cover of night. He intervened on behalf of the powerless. He punished injustice quietly and rewarded goodness without spectacle. These stories traveled northward, carried by merchants, monks, and missionaries, until they reached lands far older than Christianity itself. And there, something unexpected happened. Nicholas did not replace the old spirits. He was absorbed by them. In Central Europe, belief was not binary. The people did not discard ancient truths simply because a new god arrived. They adapted. They layered belief upon belief, creating something richer and more dangerous. When Nicholas reached the Alpine regions, the people recognized something in him. He was not a god of war. He was not a conqueror. He was a judge of behavior. And they already had one, Krampus. But where Krampus ruled through fear, Nicholas ruled through mercy. Where Krampus corrected through consequence, Nicholas corrected through example. And so, slowly, the myth evolved. Nicholas became the face of reward. Krampus remained the face of punishment. This pairing was not invented by theologians. It emerged organically, shaped by the needs of communities who understood that morality could not survive on kindness alone. Saint Nicholas alone was incomplete. Krampus alone was unbearable. Together, they formed a system that worked. Every year, as winter approached, the same tension returned. Children were watched more closely. Behavior mattered more. Small mistakes were remembered. Not because parents were cruel, but because winter was unforgiving. In early December, anticipation filled the air. St. Nicholas Day approached. Children cleaned their shoes. They recited prayers. They promised obedience. They tried to be seen. But before St. Nicholas could arrive, the shadow came first. December 5th. Krampus knocked. This was not a children's holiday. It was not festive in the modern sense. It was communal, ritualistic, and deeply psychological. Men donned heavy wooden masks carved into terrifying faces. Horns curved outward, teeth jutted unnaturally, fur covered bodies until humanity was barely visible beneath the animal form. These were not costumes, they were embodiments. When the Krampus figures walked through villages, they did not speak.
Chains dragged across stone, bells rang out in the darkness, firelight flickered across monstrous silhouettes. Children hid. Parents watched silently. The community confronted its shadow together. Krampusnacht was a reminder that fear, when controlled, could protect rather than destroy. The following day, St. Nicholas would arrive. Calm, measured, human. He wore robes, not fur. He spoke, not growled. He asked questions. He listened to confessions. He rewarded honesty, humility, and obedience. And in many stories, Krampus stood behind him, silent, watching. This image is crucial. Krampus was not acting independently. He was not chaos unleashed. He was restraint made visible. His presence reminded everyone, children and adults alike, that mercy existed only because consequence was possible. St. Nicholas did not threaten. Krampus made threats unnecessary. In these early myths, Nicholas and Krampus were not enemies. They were partners, two expressions of the same judgment. This duality reflects something deeply human. People understand fairness intuitively. Reward without effort feels wrong. Punishment without reason feels cruel. But when reward and punishment are balanced, order emerges. This is why the Nicholas-Krampus pairing endured for centuries. But institutions struggle with ambiguity. Christianity, as it grew more centralized, required clarity. Good and evil had to be distinct. Angels and demons needed clear boundaries. Gray areas were dangerous. Krampus existed entirely in the gray. He punished wrongdoing, but looked like a demon. He enforced order, but inspired fear. He was useful, but uncontrollable. And so, slowly, the church began to reinterpret him. Krampus's animal features were no longer seen as natural. They became symbols of sin. His chains, once warnings, became representations of bondage to evil. His shifted from evolent disciplinarian to malevolent force. Nicholas, meanwhile, was purified. He became softer, kinder, less judgmental, more forgiving. Over time, the distance between them widened. Nicholas ascended toward sainthood and holiness. Krampus descended toward demonization. But among the people, the old understanding remained. They knew something doctrine could not erase, that fear had once saved them, that discipline had preserved life, that Krampus had a purpose. Even as sermons condemned him, parents still whispered his name. Even as churches discouraged his image, villages continued Krampusnacht in secret, because Krampus spoke to something older than religion. He spoke to instinct. As generations passed, St. Nicholas evolved again. His image traveled westward. He merged with new traditions. He crossed oceans. He lost his robes and gained a red suit. He lost his severity and gained a smile. Eventually, he became Santa Claus. And somewhere along that journey, Krampus was left behind. Not defeated, abandoned. But abandonment is not the same as disappearance, because shadows do not vanish when light direction changes. They simply wait.
There is a moment in every mythology when balance becomes inconvenient. For centuries, Krampus and St. Nicholas existed side by side, one in light, the other in shadow. Together they formed a moral system that worked not because it was gentle, but because it was honest. People understood it instinctively. Children feared it. Adults respected it. But institutions do not trust instinct. They trust control. As Christianity expanded its authority across Europe, it began to reshape not only belief, but memory itself. Old gods were renamed. Ancient spirits were recast as demons. What could not be absorbed was condemned. Krampus stood at the center of this problem. He did not belong to Scripture. He did not obey doctrine. He was not summoned by prayer or confession. Krampus existed in folklore, where power flowed from shared belief rather than hierarchy, and that made him dangerous. At first, the church tolerated him. Krampus was useful. Fear kept children obedient. Discipline kept families aligned with Christian morality. But tolerance has limits, and Krampus tested them. He looked wrong. In Christian iconography, horns belonged to the devil, hooves belonged to demons. Fur and animal features symbolized humanity's fallen, sinful nature. Krampus embodied all of these symbols without apology. Yet he was not tempting souls. He was correcting behavior. This contradiction unsettled theologians. How could a figure that resembled a demon serve a moral function? How could fear be allowed to teach when salvation was meant to come from grace? Slowly, subtly, the narrative shifted. Krampus was no longer described as a necessary force. He became a corruption. His chains, once warnings, were reinterpreted as tools of torment. His sack, once symbolic of consequence, became a device for kidnapping souls. His presence, once seasonal and controlled, was described as chaotic and malicious. Stories changed. Where Krampus once corrected disobedient children, he now sought to drag them into darkness. Where he once enforced order, he now represented rebellion against divine authority. Krampus was declared a demon. This declaration was not a single event. It unfolded over centuries. Sermons warned against him. Religious texts associated horned figures with Satan. Festivals celebrating Krampusnacht were discouraged, then condemned. Masks were burned. Parades were outlawed. Rituals were labeled pagan corruption. But repression does not erase belief. It forces it underground. In remote villages, far from cathedrals and bishops, Krampus survived. Not openly, not proudly, quietly. Parents still warned their children. Elders still remembered the old stories. Masks were hidden in barns. Celebrations were moved into the forests, away from watchful eyes. Krampus became forbidden knowledge, and forbidden things grow powerful. As the church continued to sanitize St. Nicholas, Krampus absorbed everything that was removed: severity, judgment, fear. Where Nicholas became softer, Krampus grew darker. This was not because Krampus changed, it was because projection did. Everything Christianity sought to suppress, instinct, discipline, consequence, was cast onto Krampus. He became the container for humanity's rejected shadow. Carl Jung would later describe this process precisely. What a culture refuses to acknowledge in itself, it projects outward as a monster. Krampus became that monster. But even as he was demonized, something curious happened. He did not disappear from memory. Instead, he became more vivid. Art from the late medieval period depicts Krampus with exaggerated features, long tongues, glowing eyes, massive horns. These images were meant to frighten people away from him. Instead, they ensured he would never be forgotten. Fear preserves stories better than reverence. Children remembered Krampus long after they forgot sermons. His image lingered in nightmares. His name carried weight. And the church knew it. That is why suppression intensified. By the early modern period, Krampusnacht celebrations were officially banned in many regions. Participants were fined or arrested. Authorities framed the rituals as dangerous, immoral, and disorderly. But the people resisted in small ways. They reframed Krampusnacht as folklore. They disguised ritual as entertainment. They passed stories orally instead of writing them down. Krampus survived because he adapted. As Europe entered the Age of Reason, fear became unfashionable. Enlightenment philosophy emphasized logic, progress, and human control over nature. Superstition was ridiculed. Monsters were dismissed. Krampus was labeled a relic of ignorance. But again, he did not vanish. He waited.
Because Krampus is not sustained by belief alone. He is sustained by structure, and structure never disappears. As the modern world emerged, something subtle shifted. Communities became less bound by shared consequence. Industrialization removed humans from nature's immediate punishments. Children no longer faced the same survival risks. Discipline softened. And with that softening, something was lost. Santa Claus, once St. Nicholas, became increasingly abstract. He was no longer a judge of behavior, but a symbol of generosity detached from consequence. Rewards arrived regardless of effort. Goodness became assumed rather than earned. Krampus, meanwhile, became more fascinating. Why? Because he represented what society had discarded. He represented accountability, and accountability is uncomfortable. By the 19th century, Krampus began resurfacing in unexpected places: satirical art, dark literature, unsettling holiday postcards. These images portrayed him as grotesque, terrifying, even absurd. But satire is often a disguise for truth. People were not mocking Krampus, they were remembering him. The church's attempt to destroy Krampus had failed. Instead, it had transformed him into something far more enduring: an archetype. An idea that cannot be erased because it reflects a psychological reality. Every system that rewards must also punish. Every moral structure requires enforcement. Every light casts a shadow. Krampus was that shadow. And shadows do not die when you turn away from them. They grow longer.
The modern world believed it had outgrown monsters. As cities expanded and machines replaced seasons, humanity began to imagine itself liberated from the forces that once ruled it. Winter no longer decided who lived and who died. Food arrived regardless of harvest. Heat came from walls, not firewood. Darkness could be erased with a switch. Fear, once a teacher, became something to eliminate. And with fear, figures like Krampus were dismissed as relics of a primitive age. Or so it seemed. Because what the modern world truly abandoned was not fear itself, but the structure fear once enforced. Santa Claus remained, but he was transformed. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, St. Nicholas had completed his metamorphosis. He shed his robes, his severity, his judgment. He became Santa Claus, round, smiling, endlessly generous. He asked nothing. He forgave everything. He rewarded without scrutiny. In this version of the myth, goodness was assumed, behavior was secondary. Gifts arrived regardless of discipline. The shadow was gone. And for a time, the world celebrated that loss. Childhood was reimagined as sacred, fragile, untouchable. Fear was labeled harmful. Discipline softened into suggestion. Consequences became negotiable. But something subtle began to fracture beneath the surface. Because systems without consequence do not disappear, they destabilize. In psychology, this imbalance has a name: the rejection of the shadow. Carl Jung described the shadow as the part of the psyche that contains everything society refuses to acknowledge: aggression, fear, authority, discipline, punishment. When the shadow is denied, it does not vanish, it returns distorted. Krampus did not return as folklore, he returned as obsession. In the 20th century, artists began to rediscover him, not as a children's figure, but as a symbol. Dark holiday postcards depicted him looming behind Santa, dragging chains, holding switches, watching silently. These images unsettled people. They were not nostalgic, they felt confrontational. Krampus represented something uncomfortable, the idea that joy without restraint is meaningless. As Europe rebuilt after wars and upheaval, Krampus resurfaced in underground culture. Rural communities revived Krampusnacht openly again, not as punishment, but as ritual. Masks became more elaborate, horns grew larger, performances became more intense. These celebrations were not about scaring children anymore, they were about confronting adulthood. Men and women wore Krampus masks to embody what they could not express openly: anger, authority, judgment, fear, responsibility. The same emotions modern society demanded they suppress. Krampusmacht became a controlled release, a reminder that darkness acknowledged is less dangerous than darkness denied. Meanwhile, popular culture discovered Krampus in its own way. Horror films portrayed him as a monster stalking cheerful suburbs. Music embraced his image as rebellion against sanitized traditions. Artists depicted him towering behind Santa Claus, not attacking him, but overshadowing him. This imagery resonated because on a subconscious level, people recognized the truth. Santa Claus without Krampus feels dishonest. A system that promises reward without consequence breeds entitlement. A culture that avoids fear loses respect for boundaries. A childhood without discipline produces adults unprepared for reality. Krampus returned as the symbol of that missing weight. He was no longer a disciplinarian for children, he became a mirror for adults. In the modern interpretation, Krampus does not punish children for misbehavior, he punishes societies for forgetting balance. This is why his resurgence coincides with periods of instability, economic uncertainty, cultural fragmentation, loss of shared values. When systems feel hollow, archetypes resurface to fill the void. Krampus does not ask permission to return, he emerges where structure collapses. And the irony is striking. The same world that rejected fear now consumes it as entertainment. Horror films, dark mythology, violent narratives, all expressions of the shadow seeking form. Krampus fits perfectly into this hunger. He is not random violence, he is purposeful fear. He does not destroy for pleasure, he enforces limits. This is why popular audiences find him compelling rather than repulsive. He represents accountability without apology. He does not explain himself, he does not negotiate, he simply exists. And existence alone changes behavior. Santa Claus still delivers gifts, but Krampus asks a question. Did you deserve them? This question unsettles modern culture because it challenges a foundational assumption that goodness is inherent, not earned. Krampus insists otherwise. He insists that behavior matters, that discipline shapes outcome, that joy without effort is empty. In this sense, Krampus is not regressive, he is corrective. And perhaps that is why, in a world overwhelmed by indulgence, he feels necessary again. Krampus does not demand a return to cruelty, he demands a return to balance. He reminds humanity of something it once knew instinctively, that light is meaningful only because darkness exists. And as long as Santa Claus continues to smile without judgment, the shadow behind him will continue to grow, waiting.
Every myth that survives for centuries does so for a reason. It is not because it is entertaining. It is not because it is frightening. It is because it reveals something human beings cannot fully explain, but instinctively understand. Krampus is one of those myths. And to understand him completely, one must finally confront the truth that modern culture has worked tirelessly to avoid. Krampus was never meant to replace Santa Claus. He was never meant to oppose him. Krampus exists because Santa alone is incomplete. Long before the red suit, the sleigh, and the laughter, Saint Nicholas functioned as a moral authority. He judged behavior. He rewarded discipline. He acknowledged wrongdoing. His kindness carried weight because it followed scrutiny. But over time, that scrutiny disappeared. Santa Claus became pure generosity without judgment, a symbol of endless reward, a promise that goodness is automatic and consequences are optional. In doing so, the myth lost half of itself. Krampus became that missing half. He did not vanish when Santa was simplified. He moved into the background. He stepped behind the smiling figure, becoming invisible but not inactive. Because myths do not die when they are ignored.
they move into shadow. The relationship between Santa and Krampus mirrors a truth found in nearly every ancient belief system. Light and darkness are not enemies, they are complementary forces. Day has no meaning without night. Order cannot exist without the threat of disorder. In psychology, this relationship is described as the balance between the ego and the shadow. The ego presents what we want to be seen. The shadow holds what we refuse to acknowledge. Santa Claus is the ego of the Christmas myth. Krampus is its shadow. Santa represents generosity, joy, innocence, forgiveness. Krampus represents discipline, fear, accountability, consequence. One without the other creates distortion. A culture that embraces only Santa becomes indulgent. A culture that embraces only Krampus becomes cruel. The original myth understood this. Modern society does not. This is why Krampus feels unsettling today, not because he is violent, but because he reminds us of what we have removed. He asks a question that modern culture avoids. What happens when actions have no consequences? The answer is not abstract, it is visible everywhere. When reward is detached from effort, entitlement grows. When discipline is framed as harm, responsibility weakens. When fear is denied entirely, chaos fills the void. Krampus does not create fear, he reveals it. He reveals the fear of accountability, the fear of judgment, the fear that perhaps not everyone deserves what they receive. Santa Claus tells us we are all good. Krampus asks us to prove it. And that tension is ancient. In the oldest versions of the myth, Santa and Krampus arrive together, not as rivals, but as a unit. One speaks, the other stands silent. One gives, the other watches. That silence matters. Krampus does not argue, he does not explain, he does not justify himself. His authority comes from inevitability. He represents consequences that do not negotiate. Modern portrayals often misunderstand this and reduce Krampus to a horror villain, but that interpretation misses the point. Krampus is not random destruction, he is structured correction. He does not punish because he enjoys it, he punishes because order requires enforcement. This is why he appears seasonally. He is not omnipresent, he arrives when judgment is due. Krampus is not cruelty. He is the price of structure. And that price is uncomfortable, which is why modern culture prefers Santa alone. But even as Santa dominates public imagery, Krampus continues to return. In films, in art, in festivals, in dark retellings of holiday myths. The more Santa becomes commercialized and hollow, the more Krampus gains symbolic weight, because the psyche demands balance. You cannot erase the shadow without consequences. In Jungian terms, when the shadow is denied, it does not disappear, it becomes autonomous. It manifests in distorted ways: violence, obsession, projection, fear without form. Krampus is fear with form. He gives the shadow a face, a role, a boundary. This is why cultures that acknowledge him do not descend into chaos. They ritualize him, they confront him, they limit him. Krampusnacht is not about terror, it is about containment. A society that ritualizes its darkness remains stable. A society that denies it becomes unstable. Krampus is the reminder of that truth. When children once feared Krampus, it was not because adults wanted to traumatize them. It was because adults understood something modern parenting often forgets. Fear, when controlled, teaches respect. Not terror, respect.
Krampus taught that rules mattered even when no one was watching, that behavior had consequences beyond immediate punishment, that survival depended on discipline. Those lessons were never about obedience to authority. They were about responsibility to community. Santa Claus today asks nothing of us. Krampus still does. And that is why he lingers. He lingers behind the red suit, behind the laughter, behind the lights. He watches the celebration and waits to see if it has meaning or if it has become hollow ritual. Krampus is not anti-joy. He is anti-false joy. Joy without effort, reward without responsibility, light without shadow. Those are illusions, and illusions do not last. So every winter, as the nights grow longer and silence deepens, something ancient stirs. Not in forests alone, but in memory, in instinct, in the part of the human mind that remembers when survival required discipline. Krampus does not ask to be believed in. He only asks to be acknowledged. Because whether we name him or not, the principle he represents remains unchanged. Every system that rewards must also judge. Every culture that celebrates must also discipline. Every light must cast a shadow. And behind Santa, always, inevitably, the shadow walks.